My friends, let me ask you something. Have you ever seen a moment when the entire world, from the most powerful nations to the voices of ordinary people, suddenly decides to stand together? History is full of leaders who believed they were untouchable, protected by power, money, and alliances. But history also shows us that when the world unites, when people rise, even the strongest walls can fall. Today, we are witnessing one of those rare moments, a boycott that started as whispers in classrooms, protests in the streets, and debates in parliaments has now grown into a storm shaking the foundations of global politics. At the United Nations, we saw something that many thought impossible, a revolt that brought countries together across cultures and continents, all speaking in one voice. This is not just about Israel or one leader or one conflict. This is about the future of international justice, about whether principles still matter in a world often driven by power. In this speech, I will take you through how the boycott gained strength, how the UN made history, how economic pressure is reshaping power, how Netanyahu now faces isolation, and how people, yes, people like you and me, have become the real drivers of change. Stay with me till the end, because what you will hear today is not just politics, it is proof that your voice, your choices, and your courage can shape the destiny of nations. The global boycott movement against Israel has reached a point that can only be described as historic. What was once considered a fragmented effort, scattered across different continents and limited to civil society campaigns, has now grown into a powerful and coordinated international stance. From Europe to Asia, from Africa to South America, governments, institutions, businesses, and ordinary citizens are aligning in a way that reflects a deep moral awakening. The central force driving this boycott is not merely politics, but rather a collective conscience that rejects policies seen as unjust and oppressive. It has become a global language of resistance, spoken in the halls of parliament, universities, and corporate boardrooms, proving that the world is no longer willing to remain silent. This movement is significant because it has broken barriers that many thought were impossible. In the past, criticism of Israel was often isolated or dismissed as symbolic gestures without real power. Today, the boycott has grown into a strategic tool of international diplomacy. It is reshaping trade patterns, with certain industries reconsidering their investments, supply chains being redirected, and partnerships being frozen. Even financial institutions are beginning to factor in reputational risks when dealing with entities linked to Israeli policies. Such economic consequences, when multiplied across different regions, create a pressure that cannot be ignored, no matter how powerful a government may be. And Europe has played a key role in this momentum. Countries with strong democratic traditions and human rights values are beginning to reflect those principles in their foreign policies. Universities are divesting, companies are reassessing contracts, and governments are finding it harder to justify business as usual in the face of growing public demand for accountability. This is not confined to Europe alone. Nations in the global south, many of which have histories of colonial struggle, see this boycott as a natural extension of their own fight for dignity and justice. When their voices join those of larger economies, the impact resonates even further. What makes this moment historic is not only the scale, but also the unity of purpose. Different cultures, political systems, and economic powers are converging on a single demand that international law and human rights cannot be compromised. This collective strength is setting an example for future struggles around the world. It demonstrates that boycotts, when pursued with clarity and moral conviction, can transform into a force stronger than weapons or sanctions. It is the world declaring that principles matter more than alliances, and that justice is no longer negotiable. The revolt at the United Nations represents more than just a diplomatic vote. It is a symbolic turning point in how the world addresses issues of occupation, justice, and accountability. For decades, discussions around Israel's policies often ended in stalemates, vetoes, or watered-down resolutions that had little real impact. This time, however, the global stage witnessed a rare consensus that transcended regional alliances and political divisions. The fact that so many nations stood together, despite their differences, sends a powerful message. The world has reached a point where silence is no longer an option. This shift within the UN signals not only frustration with one country's actions, but also a wider demand for fairness in how international law is applied. For years, the UN has been criticized as a place where power politics dominated justice. Major powers often shielded Israel from meaningful accountability, creating the perception that some nations were above the rules. The recent revolt has begun to challenge that imbalance. Smaller nations, often overlooked in global politics, have joined forces with mid-sized powers to amplify their voices. Their collective action has tipped the scales, showing that international institutions can, under the right conditions, reflect the will of the majority rather than the interests of a few. This is not only about Israel, but also about reshaping the credibility of the United Nations itself. When a broad coalition demands accountability, it strengthens the institution's relevance in a world where global trust is in decline. The implications of this revolt are wide-reaching. Diplomatically, it isolates leaders like Netanyahu, who now finds his country standing increasingly alone in international forums. Economically, it gives legitimacy to boycotts and sanctions that might have otherwise been dismissed as fringe measures. Politically, it emboldens movements across the globe that are calling for justice in their own regions, proving that persistence in the face of powerful opposition can yield results. The UN revolt, therefore, becomes not just a story of Israel and Palestine, but a case study in how international solidarity can create real change. What makes this moment especially significant is its potential to inspire a new era of diplomacy. If nations continue to unite on principles rather than interests, the future of global governance could shift toward fairness and balance. The revolt may not end conflicts overnight, but it plants the seeds of a new international order where accountability is no longer selective and where justice has the power to outweigh political convenience. Economic pressure has emerged as one of the most effective tools of resistance in the modern world, and the growing boycott against Israel shows how powerful this strategy can become. Unlike wars or armed conflicts, economic measures strike at the foundations of stability without the need for physical confrontation. They affect trade, investments, financial markets, and diplomatic relations in ways that leaders cannot ignore. The boycott is no longer just a moral statement. It is a tangible force that influences decision-making in boardrooms, parliaments, and ministries of finance. Every cancelled contract, every divestment, every halted trade deal becomes part of a larger wave that steadily builds momentum. The strength of economic pressure lies in its universality. Governments, corporations, institutions, and individuals can all contribute to it, creating layers of influence that collectively exert immense weight. For example, when universities divest from companies tied to controversial policies, it not only sends a symbolic message, but also impacts the flow of investments. When multinational corporations reconsider their partnerships, it creates ripples in industries that depend on international trade. Even consumers, through boycotts of certain products, become part of a wider movement that directly affects revenue streams. This alignment of grassroots action with institutional measures transforms economic pressure into a global mechanism for change. What makes this form of resistance particularly powerful is its ability to reshape the cost-benefit calculations of governments. A leader can withstand criticism in speeches or protests, but when economic losses accumulate and international investors begin to hesitate, the consequences become harder to dismiss. Trade disruptions can harm industries, sanctions can block financial growth, and boycotts can erode a country's international standing. For Israel, which has long relied on strong economic ties with Western nations, these pressures highlight a vulnerability that is difficult to shield against, no matter how advanced its political or military strategies may be. The boycott also demonstrates that economic strategies are now as influential as traditional diplomatic or military tools. In today's interconnected world, where financial systems and trade networks link nations together, targeting the economy is often more effective than any weapon. This reality reflects a broader shift in global power dynamics where nations and people can challenge policies through their wallets, investments, and purchasing power. The growing boycott has revealed that economics is not just about numbers and markets, but about values and justice. It proves that when collective conscience is translated into economic action, it becomes a force capable of reshaping policies and redefining international relationships. Benjamin Netanyahu's position on the global stage has shifted dramatically from influence to isolation. And this change reflects how international politics can turn when principles outweigh alliances. For years, Netanyahu managed to secure support from powerful allies, especially in the West, while projecting an image of strength and resilience at home. His leadership often relied on the belief that Israel's strategic value and strong lobbying networks would shield it from meaningful consequences. Yet, the current wave of boycotts and the historic revolt at the United Nations show that even leaders with deep-rooted connections are not immune to global shifts in conscience. The message is clear. When a leader is perceived as standing against the tide of justice, even old allies begin to reconsider their loyalty. The isolation Netanyahu faces is not merely political. It carries diplomatic and economic implications as well. Traditional partners that once offered unconditional support are now being forced to reassess their stance because of growing domestic pressure from their own citizens, institutions, and civil society. European nations in particular are increasingly vocal about the inconsistency between their values of human rights and their policies of engagement with Israel. This puts Netanyahu in a vulnerable position where handshakes and state visits no longer guarantee the legitimacy he once enjoyed. When leaders are questioned not just in foreign capitals, but also by their own diaspora communities abroad, their isolation becomes even more pronounced. This decline in global standing also affects Israel's strategic calculations. Diplomacy is built on networks of trust and mutual benefit, but when a leader becomes a symbol of controversy, other nations become cautious about being publicly aligned with them. For Netanyahu, the loss of symbolic support is as damaging as any material consequence. Each abstention in the UN, each diplomatic snub, and each cancelled summit represents a small fracture in his international armor. Together, they create an environment where Israel is left with fewer partners willing to stand firmly by its side in times of crisis. The broader implication of Netanyahu's isolation is that it reflects a change in how the world views leadership. Influence can no longer be maintained by rhetoric alone. It must align with global expectations of justice and accountability. The fact that his once reliable allies are distancing themselves illustrates a new era where the cost of ignoring human rights is becoming too high even for powerful nations. His isolation serves as a warning to leaders everywhere. A political strength is fragile when it is built on defiance of international norms. The rise of people power in international politics has become one of the defining features of this moment. And the global movement surrounding Israel is proof of how ordinary voices can influence the highest levels of diplomacy. Unlike traditional statecraft, which was once dominated by governments, corporations, and elite decision makers, the current wave of activism shows that citizens, students, workers, and civil society organizations can shape the international agenda. It is not only leaders at the United Nations or presidents in their offices who are driving the boycott and revolt, but also everyday people who are demanding that their governments act in accordance with justice. This shift represents a deeper democratization of global politics, where the concerns of ordinary citizens are no longer confined to domestic policies but extend to international conflicts and human rights struggles. Movements on university campuses, for example, have been instrumental in fueling divestment campaigns that pressure institutions to cut financial ties with companies complicit in controversial policies. Social media has amplified these efforts, giving young people platforms to organize, mobilize, and connect their struggles across continents. A protest in London, a campaign in Johannesburg, and a rally in Buenos Aires can now inspire one another in real time, creating a global web of resistance. This interconnectedness transforms local activism into a worldwide force that governments cannot easily dismiss. Corporations, too, are beginning to feel the weight of people power. As consumers become more informed, they are making purchasing decisions that align with their values. When public pressure mounts, companies fear reputational damage and begin to reevaluate partnerships, trade deals, and investments. This dynamic shows how individuals, through collective economic choices, can compel even the most powerful businesses to take a stand. Governments, in turn, are pushed to respond, as ignoring public opinion risks political backlash. What was once a grassroots voice becomes a national demand and eventually an international consensus. What makes this moment particularly striking is the unity across different backgrounds and cultures. People from diverse faiths, political systems, and regions are rallying around a shared cause, proving that justice is a universal principle that transcends borders. Their actions remind leaders that legitimacy is not only derived from military or economic power, but also from moral authority granted by the people. The current boycott and UN revolt illustrate how collective voices, once dismissed as noise, have now become the very engine of change in global politics. This is people power at its peak, persistent, united, and capable of shaping history. Ladies and gentlemen, as we reflect on this historic moment, we see how the world has shifted in ways that were once unimaginable. A global boycott that began with scattered voices has now transformed into a powerful movement uniting nations, institutions, and individuals. The revolt at the United Nations has shown us that justice is no longer selective, and that even the strongest political figures can be held accountable when global conscience rises. Economic pressure has proven itself to be more than just a tool. It has become a language of resistance, reshaping trade, diplomacy, and trust. Netanyahu's growing isolation is not simply the story of one leader, but a lesson to every government that values cannot be ignored forever. Most importantly, the rise of people power reminds us that the true strength of history lies not in the hands of a few, but in the collective voice of humanity. The message is clear. When people unite, when nations choose principles over politics, and when justice is placed above convenience, even the mighty structures can be challenged and changed. This is not just about Israel or one revolt at the UN. It is about a new chapter in international politics where accountability, fairness, and unity guide the path forward. I wish each of you the courage to continue questioning, the wisdom to stand for what is right, and the belief that your voice, no matter how small, contributes to shaping the future. Thank you for being part of this journey. Thank you for listening, and good luck to all of you as we walk together toward a world that values justice, peace, and dignity for all.